You're watching Q&A live from Melbourne. Our next question comes from Brittany Witnish.
Hi. I grew up in out-of-home care but had to leave care at 18. When I left care, I lost all of my supports and had to care for myself in unstable and at times unsafe transitional housing, whilst also attempting to stay in education, as I had a dream to get a degree and be a social worker. However, only 1% of young care leavers end up in higher education. Other countries like the US, UK, Canada and New Zealand extend care to 21 with great outcomes. My question is, when will the federal government take responsibility and provide young people in out-of-home care those 3 extra years of support and stability to prepare themselves for independence?
Corey White, you've had lived experience in foster care. Do you think those 3 years would make a difference?
Yeah, and first I just want to say thank you for that question. I'm so proud of you for asking it, and also quite happy that Q&A is doing this topic because it's been ignored for far too long. The out-of-home care system in this country is absolutely broken, and we need a revolution to fix it and to fix the children that are suffering in it. Just first things first, I don't think it can be really tackled at the federal level. States deal with child protection, but I think your point still stands. There are all of these horrible health and justice and mental health outcomes for people in foster care. I believe that there was a report recently that young homeless people, 60% of them have just left foster care. So 60% of the young homeless are former foster kids. You have extraordinary rates of mental illness, of drug abuse, of jail, of imprisonment and jail among former foster kids. And, you know, we live in a time now where, you know, something like 60% of young people are staying home with their parents. Rent is very expensive. You know, the cost of living is so high. They want to stay there while they can work and study. And foster kids, out-of-home care kids, need to basically clear out of foster care at the age of 18.
They get booted out, effectively.
They get booted out. And many of them don't stay with the foster carers that they were with because there's no money to support them. And I think there's a lot of evidence coming out of the UK and the US that extending that support to the age of 21 would make an enormous difference.
Catherine King, do you agree that there's no real function for the federal government here to change this, given that it's driven by the states?
No, I don't. And the first thing I want to say to Brittany, congratulations. I really hope that you make it. I started my career as a social worker and I worked with kids in foster care when I was 21. And you're right, Corey, the system for after-home care out-of-home care is really broken. Yeah. I think it is too young, 18. I know there are some states who've started to do a bit more work in looking at what that transition is for some kids, but I think there is a role for the federal government. At the end of the day, we are picking up welfare bills, we're picking up a whole lot of social services and health bills, and I think we've got to start to have that conversation because at the end of the day, we want people to have the best opportunity they possibly can, no matter what their circumstances. So I really hope you make it through uni, and social work's a fantastic career.
Sarah Henderson, should the federal government acknowledge that there is sort of back-end responsibility here, therefore a responsibility to do something about those 3 years?
Look, can I also say, Brittany, well done on asking the question and being brave enough to talk about your own circumstances. And Corey, you're also an inspiration in terms of how you've told your story as well. There are 48,000 children in foster care, out-of-home care around Australia. About 250 or so children every year are adopted. So I think there is a real problem at the moment. I don't think there are probably enough high-calibre foster parents. I think that's a real issue. Yep. Too many children are shunted from family to family. Children in foster care want love and permanency and a sense of family. And I know that there's a parliamentary inquiry underway at the moment, which is being chaired by Julia Banks, the Social Policy and Legal Affairs Committee. They're looking into this whole issue of adoption and out-of-home care. And New South Wales have a great model where they're starting to look at the significance and the positivity of adoption, where it's quite clear that permanent care is just not enough, where children are yearning for that sense of family and parenting and the sense of belonging. So there's some wonderful work being done in this inquiry, and I really think that perhaps through that and through COAG, because Corey is right, it is a state and territory issue, that I hope we can get some greater integration.
The federal government often acts, though, where policy is deficient or it views there being a problem with how the states are handling something to drive change. Do you think the federal government should?
Oh, look, absolutely. I think the federal government can play a very leading role, and it's already been raised amongst my colleagues. The framework is very disjointed. There's a lot of, clearly New South Wales, I think, is leading the way, and I think the federal government could play a much stronger role at establishing much better framework, and particularly embracing adoption, which I don't think, certainly here in Victoria, has not been embraced.
Corey Bernardi, have you thought much about this issue before?
Frankly, not really. Some of my friends have been involved in foster caring, and it's been a challenging environment for them because they've had issues with departments, they've had issues with some of their friends and family. But what I think the issue that's been raised here is what happens when they're 18, they're no longer in foster care. So, children, the best outcome of children is what's important, but they need a place where they can have a stable home environment, even if it's just their own or with some of their friends. You've got to make sure they've got the support services they need if they're troubled still. I think there is enough support for people to go to university, both in terms of HECS and some of the study supports that go with it. But there's a plethora of other issues from people who've come out of the foster care system that could be addressed.
If I can just chip in here, I think Sarah and Corey are right on the money there. To go back to your question, at the moment, Victoria, there's a wonderful campaign called Home Stretch, which is really pushing to increase the age of support until 21, and Tasmania and South Australia are already down that road. So there are some really positive initiatives already happening, and we don't need to just wait for the federal government to get its pants on and do something. Things are already happening, and please, everyone watching this, have a look at Home Stretch. It's a wonderful initiative, and I think Victoria is perhaps one of the best states for this, and look it up. I mean, I think that every state should be following South Australia, Tasmania and Victoria's lead here.
This is obviously a hugely complex issue. We have another question from the audience. Joyce Lee.
My question is to Corey White. As part of your solution to reducing kids in the foster care system, you support a scheme to pay drug-addicted women to take long-term contraception. But why is this a woman's issue? Shouldn't drug-addicted men also be paid to use long-term contraception?
Corey White, before we get to the specific answer of that, could you share with us tonight your experience in foster care? Yeah.
So I was in and out of foster care until the age of 10. I experienced, rape, physical abuse, sexual abuse, starvation. My mother died of a heroin overdose when I was 10, and I was in one particular foster home that was absolutely horrific.
What happened there?
All of the bad things. Lots and lots of rapes. Got a PhD in getting raped. And the foster mother was absolutely awful. And that's the context I have. And I think that in that show I didn't actually specify drug-addicted women. I specify that drug addicts should be given incentives, cash, to delay reproducing. Because the fact is that a lot of drug-addicted people do have children, and those children are condemned to lives of horror. So that's the context in which that solution is offered. Because all of these middle-class niceties aren't working. And there's a wonderful charity in America called Project Prevention, which pays, yes, mostly drug-addicted women, to be given long-term contraception. And many of the women who've had, up to a dozen children can't speak highly enough of it. Because after receiving that contraception, they know that they're not ruining future children's lives. And so that's the context. You make the point in your series, though, that if that had happened in your circumstance, you wouldn't be here. I wouldn't. I wouldn't be on this great panel. But I think that it's a cost I would be willing to pay. A child should not be born into hell, and if we can voluntarily, consensually arrange for people to delay childbirth, then we should.
Eric Jensen, what do you think about the idea of paying people? I think $5,000 is the figure to go on long-term contraception.
I mean, I wouldn't presume to, to speak to that experience when someone right beside me has lived through it. I think the government should subsidise contraception very broadly, and I think there are measures that might constitute government intervention in specific cases where, with the aid of doctors and sufficient oversight, there can be an argument for the government taking a role in paying for contraception. I'm not certain that I agree with forced contraception.
Corey Bernardi?
First principles, I can't support it. I just think it's wrong for the government to get involved in determining who can reproduce and who can't.
Oh, I'm
Except
happy
for
to,
same-sex couples.
Well, they can't reproduce, let's be frank.
I'm happy. I'm happy if it was done through the much lauded free market, if a private charity stepped up, like in America, to provide this service, because the testimonials that are coming from women who've had 6, 7, 8 children who are addicted to drugs are very powerful. They're like, I'm so glad I'm not bringing any more children into this life that I'm living at the moment. And maybe one day they'll change, and that's why it's a contraception that will wear off.
Catherine King, you're Labor's health spokesperson. Yeah. Could you envisage something like this as a Labor Party policy at the election?
Look, no, I can't, but I do think, we do have an issue in this country with access to and use of long-acting contraceptive. We have very low rates of the use of LARCs, as they're called, compared to European countries, and I think that's really important. We want every child who's born here to be wanted and loved and to be able to grow up in the best possible circumstances. But I don't think we'd be choosing, who can and can't have children, or providing incentives for people not to have them. It's not something I'd be comfortable with.
Isn't there a point at which, though, you listen to stories like Corey's and you think maybe our principles aren't helping young kids that are in households in Australia getting raped?
I think that, and of course, the circumstances that Corey has been born into, grown up into, are horrendous and shouldn't happen to any child. But if anything, the Royal Commission into institutional abuse has shown us is that this has happened across the board. And again, this is a broader issue in our society about what are we doing to protect children in whatever circumstances they're born in, whether they're in our institutions or they're in some of the wealthiest families in our communities. Abuse happens all across the board, and that's what the Commission really does have to, has asked us to do. How do we prevent this ever happening to children again? It's a really important question for all of us.
Well, I think you're raising a different issue, Catherine. I think it's a very powerful idea. I think it's a powerful idea because if it's done voluntarily, and that's the key, it's not done where someone's forced to take contraception. And if someone is addicted to drugs and realises that they are facing a real challenge and that they know that to have children at that time in their life would put that child in danger, I think it's an inspired idea. And, whether the Prime Minister or my government would take that on as a policy is another issue. But I think we face this issue with people who have a disability. Our families struggle with whether it's the right thing for them to fall pregnant under difficult circumstances. But I think it's a very, very powerful idea, providing it's voluntary. And I think it could be absolutely life-changing. And if our focus is on protecting children, then fundamentally it's a very powerful notion.
Do you think there are times when politicians are better off just maybe parking some of their high-minded ideas and looking at real-world problems and trying to solve them in the way that Corey might?
Well, that's why I'm speaking very frankly and honestly.
Do you think some of your colleagues should do that more often?
Well, I think we do, and I mean, on programs like this gives us an occasion to be asked questions that maybe we wouldn't be normally asked. But as I say, I find it a very powerful idea. And for me, I spent a year chairing an inquiry into family violence. I, have seen the terrible impacts that family violence has on children. And we have to put the child first, and I think we do that in the foster care system. I think we need to look at putting the best interests of the child first when it comes to adoption. And on Corey's idea about contraception being taken voluntarily, I think it is powerful.
A quick response. Do you see any hope in the responses you've had tonight? I mean, surprising answer from a member of the government.
Yeah, well, I appreciate Sarah's support there. I expected that from Corey.
I'm consistent.
No, yeah, it's consistent. It's the Catholic position. And Catherine, I mean, not to be rude, I feel like you skirted around it with a nice chunk of rhetoric, but
Thanks for that.
I don't mean to be mean or anything, but you're living in a dream world.
Well, I have worked in these environments. Like, I have actually been there, and I have actually worked in these environments, and I've seen, you know, some of the circumstances that you talk about. So I have got a dose of reality when it comes to these things, but I've also met lots of families, you know, who are made up of all sorts of different people, where things, you know, they do come good. They do make amazing parents, and they have, you know, given the opportunity to do so.
But if they come good, then they can stop taking the contraception, Catherine. That's the whole point.
And also, you're really rolling the dice.
Do you do it for alcoholics and gambling addicts?
You do it
and a
for
whole
people
range
who,
of things?
yeah, I
So
totally. I mean,
the government is paying people.
It doesn't even have to be the government. In
$5,000.
America, it's a charity.
I would actually love to see the modelling on this, because my gut instinct is that it's a reasonably small investment for an incredible outcome when you think of perhaps of the savings that it could create for the health system. I mean,
What's it got to do with government, though? What's it got to do with
because it's got to do
The health
with
system's
caring.
pretty much to do with
It's got to do
government.
with caring.
Government provides.
But you are then choosing who is worthy of.
No, you're not.
You are.
You're not
of course you are.
choosing. You're not choosing.
So why should the government pay $5,000? $5,000 to someone who is not capable of managing their own life to put them on contraception?
Well, no, let me answer this. Because the government pays more than $700 million over 4 years to help people with alcohol and drug abuse. So this is actually a really important part of the government's responsibility. And so, you know, I think that the government may well have a role, and as I say, I think it's a very powerful idea.
The government already has a role. State governments already fund departments of child protection. This would actually save money. Okay, if you have a child who's born to a parent who shouldn't have it, at that point in their life they're addicted to drugs, that child is taken away, costs tens and tens of thousands of dollars.
Why would the government be paying people who cannot manage their lives to take long-term contraception?
It's a saving compared to the cost of taking that child out. It is a saving.
And they're going to spend that money productively, aren't they?
Well, on contraceptives.
No, that's not what the argument is. The argument is...
I don't care what they spend it. I don't care what they spend it on.
I don't care what they spend it on.
They can spend it on jet skis.
Give free money to everyone.
Is your objection, Corey?
Hang on, Corey. The argument is we're not going to give $5,000.
No, that's what. No, sorry, that's his policy position.
No,
that's the policy
that's
position.
the value of
you can make it up if you like.
He's a comic. I don't know if we need to defend it.
I think we're straying a little bit away to the weeds there. Let's move on to another subject.